This next presentation is called Who Makes the Rules? Identifying Pathways to Change in U.S. Sanitation Regulations. And Matthew Lippincott is going to walk us through this. Matthew is a technical writer who has worked on building mechanical codes and policies for ecological sanitation since 2010. Matthew led the writing of the Recode Model Code, IATMO ANSI We Stand chapter on composting and urine diverting toilets, and the proposed International Plumbing Code appendix on urine diversion, which recently received committee approval for the 2027 IPC. Matthew is currently working with the University of Michigan's Food Ecology and Equity Designing Circular Nutrition Production (FEED CNP) program on regulatory pathways for urine diversion in Michigan, and is also my go-to person whenever I have questions about the rules. So, Matthew, take it away here. We're
Thank you,
excited.
Arthur. Today, I'd like to talk about who makes the rules and how to make change. And this comes out of work I did with Leslie Huey, Lanika Sanders, Jennifer Blush, and Nancy Love of the University of Michigan. If you had a chance to watch the videos, I don't know if they're out yet from the in-person summit. This is kind of a companion talk to Leslie Huey's talk. She summarized a bit of our research methods over the past several years, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the action research side of things. Share my presentation here. So if you look down at the bottom there, I've listed our paper. So this is summarizing some work in a paper we recently published. And this question comes of how do you make change in sanitation? And many times when people think they can't do something, they think that it is against the law and that they need to go and take a bill to Capitol Hill and have it turned into a law. And that will get the rules changed for them. But that's not necessarily how the rules get changed, because once that law specifies that the rules should change, it may include provisions that change the rules. But more often than not, it gives directives to public agencies to write regulations that then get written into the rules. Furthermore, that's not the entire picture, because you also have standards and codes that get written into the regulations by reference. And understanding this entire picture of how things make it from a law into the rules and which place in this picture to put pressure in order to get the change you need is important. And I'm going to give an example of how misunderstanding can lead to problems. And so this came out of research that Lanika Sanders and I were doing on the history, kind of laying the groundwork for our research in Michigan and our work in Michigan. And we found the story of Marion Clements. And so in the 1970s, Marion installed a composting toilet and a gray water system outside of Grand Rapids. And as the city of Grand Rapids expanded to include her homestead, she refused to hook up to Grand Rapids utilities. And after a long fight in local processes, Marion Clements had her habitability permit revoked by the city health department. And the city health department thought that might be the end of the story, except that Marion Clements had some powerful friends, and she was able to enlist them to write Michigan Senate Bill 979. And the purpose of this bill was to make it possible to have an alternative sanitation system and an alternative gray water system in combination. And so this bill worked its way through and it became a law. So that bill made its way into a law, became Michigan Compiled Law 33.12757, which allows alternative gray water systems and alternative waste treatment systems. It allows municipalities to waive requirements to hook up to the utilities if that system is considered acceptable. And most importantly, it sent a rulemaking to two different agencies. It said that the State Department of Health should determine what an acceptable system would look like and to write some guidance for counties so they would know what to look for with these acceptable systems. And then it asked counties to initiate alternative sanitation programs. And it also asked the plumbing board to determine what an acceptable plumbing system would look like here. So let's look at the rulemaking and how it went. So first came the gray water rulemaking. And the Director of Environmental Health determined that they had no guidance on what gray water was. And so they determined that gray water is sewage and that that sewage should be disposed in an approved method, which means that a gray water system was really just going to be a typical septic tank because it had to be an approved sewage treatment system. They also noted that to the extent that funds are available, the department would provide training and technical assistance. And if you know anything about government processes and the attention spans of legislatures, you may note that those funds were never made available to write that guidance. And so if we look at the intent of this law, the intent was to allow this alternative gray water systems. Well, we're not going to get alternative gray water systems. Those are just going to be your typical sewage disposal systems for on-site. And then no guidance to counties is going to be provided. There's still some hope. We can look at the plumbing rulemaking. And so the plumbing board took a look and they said, well, these non-water carried sewage treatment units, which is what they're calling a composting toilet, are not acknowledged as an acceptable method of sewage disposal. And so they can't really recommend them and they can't really consider them an acceptable system. However, if such a thing was going to be installed, they said, well, there's this standard NSF 41. I'll talk more about that later. And so if you had a product certified to that standard, that might be okay. But then you should probably also have a backup of an acceptable system, i.e. a typical sewage system. So what happened after the rulemaking? Well, it really meant that none of the intent of the law made it through the rulemaking process. So despite the legal efforts here, this law has no real force to it because there was no rulemaking. And there's no process to initiate a new rulemaking. So post rulemaking, what you ended up with was more guidance for counties, but also stricter permitting because it defined the need for twin variances that you'd have to get from the state health, from the health department and from the plumbing board. And it limited the number of options you would need, saying you'd have to get this certified product. And in the end, there was no training or guidance. So as you presented these systems to the counties, they had no idea what they were looking at. And returning to the problem of Marion Clements specifically, well, her system was ordered to be removed. Her sewer connection exemption was not granted. And they even made her get rid of her goat. So this is her goat, which unfortunately had to go. And so this idea that if you get the law passed, you could change the rules was thwarted in this regulation writing process, in this rule writing process. Because I think if Marion Clements had looked at this whole picture, she would have realized at the time that it was the standards and codes that were blocking her, and ultimately still block the ability to install an alternative composting and gray water, composting toilet and gray water system in Michigan 42 years later. So we, of course, noted this and moved on to our process of seeing how we were going to do urine recycling, taking in these lessons of what to do and where to engage. And so we start with this question, what is urine? And if you look at the current rules, you end up having to look at 4 different categories. Well, can we fit it into the sewage sludge rules? Can we fit it into the solid waste rules? Can we fit it into reclaimed water rules? Can we claim it's a fertilizer? And all of these have blocking concerns. For sewage sludge, well, urine's not solid. The FDA says that urine is not sewage sludge in their rulemaking for the Food Safety and Modernization Act. And then to get sewage sludge certified as a fertilizer, to make it a biosolid to apply to land, you would need to pass the state regulators who are going to use the AFCO, the Association of American Plant Food Control Officials guidance to determine that it was a fertilizer. And that guidance says it has to be solid. So it can't really be sewage sludge. Then we get into the solid waste category. Well, it's not solid, but it could fit, but it's still kind of an odd fit, even though there are some options there. And then with reclaimed water, well, we don't really have a reclaimed water rule in Michigan, but in other states, many of those states, there are too many nutrients in the urine to make it reclaimed water. So then with fertilizer, which seems like an open category, well, there are no rules and definitions. And so I think it can be hard to kind of go through the rules and say, well, where does something fit? And I think it's important to keep track of what we're talking about. And so I like to say, well, urine is urine. The fact that it is a nutrient source, it is excrement, and it requires some oversight for public health guidance, that is all true, but it isn't in the rules. It isn't in the law. The law does not define what urine is. It does not define the constituents of urine or what we should do with it, but that should not make us lose track of the fact that we know what urine is. It's urine. And I think that's really important because when you go into this tangle of different federal and state rules, you don't want to lose track of what you're actually doing and lose track of the message you want in communicating to officials in every one of these different programs. Now, we ultimately decided we were going to go at this fertilizer pathway first. And so that's what we did. And that was only one piece of it because this is our whole system, right? We're trying to go from excretion to food consumption into a fully circular cycle of urine recycling. And this comes with a whole bunch of different potential regulations that we would have to address. So the first thing we did, we said, well, we know we're going to address this fertilizer permit, but what else do we absolutely need to do? What's the minimum set of changes we need to make this happen? And we were saying, well, we have a large building and we really only need to do three things. We need a permit, an occupancy permit, which includes the plumbing code aspects of our work, that includes approval for the toilet. We need some sort of license for the treatment system, and we need a fertilizer permit. And if we could just get down to those three things, then we can get our urine collected, treated, turned into fertilizer, and out of our buildings, we can run field trials. And that was really helpful analysis. So then we could identify the three different components we were going to go after. Going after the plumbing code, talking to the Michigan regulatory community so that they were comfortable with what we were doing for treatment. The University of Michigan has some independence, and so actually we didn't need a treatment system license, but we did want to make sure that the people who would potentially approve such a license knew what we were doing. We were communicating with our health officials. And then through that engagement with the Michigan regulatory community, and especially the fertilizer regulators, we learned that we needed to address this Association of American Plant Food Control Officials in order to work on fertilizer permitting. And so, yeah, that's what we did. We're engaged with AFCO. We have put in a definition that we're going to defend in February for urine as a fertilizer ingredient. We received a fertilizer license from our state, from the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development for urine as a fertilizer. And then we engaged in a bunch of conferences and with a variety of different regulators at the local and national level. And then we went after change in the plumbing code, so that and discussions with our local plumbers union and local plumbers inspectors. So they understood what we were doing. And that brings me to check the time here. We have 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about participating in these different code processes as well. So when I worked at Recode Oregon back in the early 2010s, we were also looking at this issue of composting toilets in the plumbing code. And the question was, how are we going to work on getting consistent national rules given the fragmented landscape of plumbing codes in the United States? And these two maps, I've included both of these maps because these are the uniform plumbing code, the IATMO's impression of what the national code picture is. And then that's on the left. And then on the right, this is the international plumbing code, the International Code Council's idea of how codes are enforced in the United States. You'll notice that they have a pretty different interpretation of which codes are used locally. That has to do with some cities using one, whereas a lot of rural areas use another in different places. That's the case in Arizona. Um, and some states basing codes off of these model codes, some states kind of adopting them whole hog, some states leaving it up to counties. And so it's a very fragmented picture. And addressing one or the other could leave you in a situation where a state has two different sets of rules, one that allow and one that doesn't, depending on what county you're in. And I should also mention they copyright these codes. So any language submitted to one code could not be directly submitted to the other code. So we come up with this strategy. We would create our own model code and release it into the public domain so that we could then submit that language to individual code bodies. And many people who are on this call today, Laura Allen is here, of course, Ibno Hayes and Kim Nace, but many other people helped us draft this code and actually revise it 2 years ago. And we've gone through a lot of processes with this. So this is how we got it into this We Stand chapter. We also revised it, pushed it towards ICC codes. The composting toilet proposal to the ICC codes was rejected. The proposal to move We Stand into the Uniform Plumbing Code during the last code cycle was also rejected, although that continues. And but we succeeded on the International Plumbing Code. So this is a very long-term process to get these codes changed. And this is where we're at. There's still a lot more to do to actually get these codes into the plumbing codes that are being used to review your projects. So at present, even after the final approval of this 2027 International Plumbing Code appendix, you probably still need a variance to get a urine diversion system installed. It will just be much, much easier. And there are also some standards being revised now. So NSF has put out a call for people to sit on their committees. There are some new standards in development. I'm volunteering on the ICC 825 committee to try to get composting and urine diverting toilets added to their on-site system standard. There's also the build process that San Francisco Water is running, which is something to look at. And then one of the successes we had of the last code cycle was getting the IATMO, the Uniform Plumbing Code Committee, to review composting toilets in the 2030 code cycle. That'll start next year. So with that, I'll take some questions.
Thank you, Matthew. That is it's quite the world to dig our brains into. So thank you for walking us all through a great way to not be so intimidated. Let's look at questions. Let's
See,
see.
Nick Bertulis, you have a question?
Yes, go for it, Nick.
Hey, thanks, Matthew. Great talk. Really appreciate your work. And I've been doing gray water for decades, and urine and gray water are a match made in heaven. As you probably know, the carbon nitrogen ratio solves a lot of issues. As why can't urine be classified as gray water, especially considering public health is measured by quantity of risk? It seems that fecal matter from shower water and laundry water present a higher pathogen load than yellow water urine, and therefore justifiably should be gray water. Thank you.
I get back to the kind of overarching problem, which is that there's really no definition of human excreta in our sanitation rules. And so, and this is a huge challenge because when you look at the on-site systems, right, septic systems, those are just all there is a concentration standard for sewage, right? And sewage is assumed to be completely combined. And then even these standards for different treatment systems, the treatment systems only include testing standards for this combined sewage. And so we kind of have this definitional problem. Like urine doesn't exist in the regulation. It doesn't exist in the standards. No one's thinking about urine or feces, even though they're allegedly the reason the whole system exists. They don't exist as a legal entity. And that is our real problem here. It's a real problem, especially for doing any sort of alternative system that does source separation. So it's a problem for gray water because the gray water is assumed to be as dangerous as sewage with human feces in it. It's a problem for the urine diversion because the urine is like way too high in nutrients to be considered sewage, right? And it's a problem for separating out the feces because it's not liquid, and so you can't run it through any of these systems whatsoever. And so I think those definitional issues are a huge problem, and it would be great if we could solve that and actually start talking on a legal basis about the actual concerns we have about the real products, the human excreta in our environment.
Thank you, thank you. There's a couple questions from the chat, from Brian at Mass TC. What's the next step with the ICC effort? And then Carol's question kind of tags on with that kind of thing, I think so, which is where do you and the Michigan Asset Initiative have membership on key committees?
We do not have any membership on these committees. We are not like a stakeholder group that could join. I think you'd need to be part of a nonprofit or a commercial entity or a manufacturer to join these committees. So we've only been applying information, like sending information and proposals to these committees. On to Brian's question, what's the next step on the IPC effort? We have to wait for a vote of the whole IPC, the final approval vote. It's very rare for the final approval vote to reject things the committee has approved. Could happen though. So that should happen soon. And next, I believe that the results from that will be published in January. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, we can finally have that totally nailed down at the beginning of next year, I hope.
Great.
Daniela?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm on the other side of the world, far away in the UK. By any chance, do you know if UK or Europe in general are far ahead or far behind in this type of processes?
Myself and Leslie Hui went to the Source Separated Sanitation Summit in Sweden over the summer. And that was a very interesting contrast. I can't say that Europe is ahead or behind. I would mainly say it's very different. There have not been the processes to formalize codes and standards around urine diversion in Europe or around composting toilets or around source separation generally. However, there's been quite a bit of support for it. So there are a number of projects through this North Sea cooperation. So in Helsingborg and also through in the Netherlands and Germany to build source separated sanitation systems and a lot of public support for that. So I would say there's been more flexibility in Europe. And I would actually invite our European colleagues, if anyone is, I know Jenna Senecal is on the call here potentially. I saw her earlier today. I'd invite them to maybe talk about their experiences if they want. But yeah, there seems to be a lot more flexibility with European regulators, even though there hasn't been any formalization. So.
Thank you.
Jenna writes in on the chat, kind of agreeing that it's just different in Europe versus the US. We have a question from Sean. potentially a rhetorical question, but why is the legal code so blind to poop and pee? Is that an oversimplification, assumption of sewage? And I wonder if there's some cultural taboo baked in there. Any thoughts?
Well, I would say that the rules were written after the systems were designed. So that's the big issue. It's like the septic tanks have been around since the 19th century. Rules for septic tanks started getting written in the 1950s. The even for our big sewage systems, you know, the Milwaukee system, Milorganite on my water bottle here. The Milwaukee, Wisconsin system, the Jones Island opened 100 years ago before the United States required secondary treatment. So the whole kind of modern wastewater treatment system existed nearly 50 years before the Clean Water Act required everyone in the United States to have them. So the rules were just sort of written to describe existing practices. They were not written with the intention of being flexible. And so everything we've added on has kind of been a hack on that. A couple of years ago, we had Alexandra Yashki was on a panel here at the Rich Earth Summit, and she wrote a book on building codes, about the greening of America's building codes. I suggest reading that. It isn't just about green codes, but it describes the history of American building codes better than in any other book I've seen.
Great suggestion. Thanks. Any other questions, either in the chat or right in person? Well, seeing none, and we're just a few minutes early. Anything else?
Hey, can I ask? Can I?
Oh, yeah.
Mike Spooner, can you ask your question of Matthew? Because I think it'd be helpful to talk about the tiny house that's mobile, and Matthew's thought a little bit about this. So maybe we can just take the next minutes we have and talk about what exists and what would have to happen.
Yeah, I actually talked to Matthew at the in-person summit, and we shared some of our shared experience with the ICC.
Yeah, I think the thought there was that since you aren't subject to the plumbing code, you can do some more interesting systems. Carol talks about this. Carol McCreary, who's on this call as well, talks about this with systems on boats. So boats, RVs, etc. You aren't subject to the plumbing code, although the treatment, those systems require to be discharged to treatment systems. So, you know, if I think the flexibility would come for a different site. I want to highlight here, because this question was asked, Danielle had asked this question about Europe, and Jenna actually answered in the chat, right? So she said that they are working on a fertilizer product regulation on the EU level to receive this component material category to classify raw material used in products like fertilizers, and specifically urine, which is very helpful. That's similar to what we're trying to do with the Association of American Plant Food Control Officials here in the US. So yeah, thank you, Jenna, for writing that in. That's very helpful.
One story, Matthew, if you just in our last couple of minutes, that reminds me of, if you'd be willing to tell this story that might be new for some people, about the communication between the New Hampshire and Michigan AA AFCO.
Oh yeah,
that's really interesting kind of dynamic.
One of the big lessons, you know, in my talk, I talked about how you can get a law and the rulemaking can be kind of adverse to the law that you get passed, right? On the other side, working with regulators who make the rulemaking can be very helpful. And so when we were working with Michigan Department of Agriculture regulators, they were very helpful to us in writing our permitting and helping us figure out how to engage nationally. And when New Hampshire regulators when Rich Earth contacted New Hampshire regulators about certifying their product as a fertilizer, it started a back channel conversation in a private chat that state regulators had. And our Michigan regulators went to bat for urine, telling other people that they thought this was a good idea. And that helped us get some wins in other states, we believe, in Vermont and Massachusetts this year. And so I think instead of going after like that legal change, engaging regulators over time and building coalition with them and showing that you're doing a good job can make even though it seems like a small thing in your state, it can have a national effect. So yeah, thanks for that, Arthur.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for bringing all of our attention to that story originally. That was great.